Good morning, all. Welcome. Marni Nanpundi to the SafeWork SA webinar in collaboration with Return to Work SA. We'll be presenting on managing musculoskeletal disorder risks from hazardous manual tasks, gaps, and opportunities. You'll be hearing acronyms such as MSDs for musculoskeletal disorders and HMTs for hazardous manual tasks throughout the presentation. There will also be QR codes in slides to direct you to different tools and resources referenced throughout the presentation. We will aim to have short Q&As at the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions, please post them in the Teams group chat, which will be monitored during the webinar. So firstly, on behalf of our panel, I'd like to acknowledge this land that we meet and present from today as the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and we will respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their culture and heritage beliefs are still as important to the Kaurna people today. Okay, so let me introduce you to the panel participants. We have Haran Zergan, who holds a PhD in the field of occupational health, safety and ergonomics, and is the principal inspector within the work environment at SafeWork SA. Welcome, Haran.
Thanks, Olga, and good morning, everyone.
And our second panelist is Alex Arnath, who is qualified physiotherapist who works as an injury risk consultant at Return to Work SA. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Olga, and lovely to be here with everyone this morning. Welcome.
All right, let's just set the scene. So MSDs remain one of the most significant contributors to workers' compensation claims across almost every industry yet. Often we are approached as individual injuries rather than predictable outcomes of work design. This session positions MSDs as a systems issue shaped by task demands, physical exposures, and organisational decisions rather than solely by the worker behaviour. Our presenters will be walking us through the mechanisms and significance of these injuries and what is required from businesses under the work health and safety laws. Then they will be sharing some of the gaps and opportunities that have been identified during compliance and enforcement activities by SafeWork SA and engagement in businesses by Return to Work SA, with a range of examples and tools to help you preventing these injuries in the workplace. Without further ado, I invite Alex Arnath from Return to Work SA to give us insights on the physiological aspect about these injuries and how they occur.
Well, thank you, Olga, and I think it is a nice kind of place to start when we're talking about MSDs and hazardous manual tasks to try and understand how these injuries come about and the different factors that might be at play with these. And what we can do, we can start, I guess, at a tissue tolerance level. And there's some pictures here on your screen that show, I guess the one on the left is more of what we would call a normal picture, where a tissue, any structure in your body has a certain level of tolerance to it. And as we apply load or force throughout a task or an activity, that tolerance will start to drop away. When we then have a period of rest and recovery, the tolerance tends to build back up and we're good to go again the next time we need to do something. The picture in the middle shows a slightly different scenario where we're not getting that rest and recovery time. So we keep applying a force to those structures and we get eventually this intersection point where the force being applied is now greater than the tolerance of those structures. And that's where injuries and pain and discomfort can start to creep in and be recognised by the people doing those tasks. The third example there is different again, and this is more of a breakthrough type phenomenon where a force or a load might be applied that is just simply too much for those structures to be able to withstand, and that's where you'll typically find your more acute type injuries arising from. And I think this is how we've thought about things for quite some time, and there's still a lot of truth in this. But if we go to the next slide, Olga, what we'll see is that we actually need to start thinking more broadly than just at a tissue tolerance level. What we know now from a lot of research that's happened over the last couple of decades, really, is that MSDs are the product of many, many factors, both physical and psychosocial. And so we can start to understand the different sources of the risk when we're thinking about hazardous tasks. So it might be things around the design and the layout of the work area. It might be the actual characteristics of the load or the object that we might be handling. So the size of it, the weight of it, the dimensions of it. Is it slippery? Is it easy to hold? Those types of factors. The environmental conditions where we do the task, a really important factor when it comes to the risk of an injury developing, but sometimes gets overlooked. So you think of the weather outside, if you're in Adelaide today, pretty wet and wild. So what you're doing outside today might be different if it was, 40 degrees and sunny, for example. There'll be different risk factors because of the nature of the environment. And really crucially, and something Haran and I will talk a lot to if you give us half a chance, the systems of work. Really big factor in the likelihood of injuries developing. And so when we think about these sources of risk, what we find is there's now a lot of physical and psychosocial elements that are going to combine and create mechanical changes within our body, but also these stress responses where you get hormone changes, leads to reduced blood flow, reduced tissue healing, inflammation, swelling, and people's thoughts and beliefs around this. And when you put all of those together, that's where we find this end result being a musculoskeletal disorder. So it's just to give an overview to say we need to think really broadly if we want to tackle this problem in its entirety. If we go to the next slide, please, Olga. We can then start to think about what's the scope of this problem in South Australia. So we've got a lot of numbers on this page. I'll talk you through them quickly, but suffice to say that musculoskeletal disorders have been and continue to be the leading cause of compensation claim in South Australia and actually nationally as well. So we see 35% of all the claims that get lodged are for MSDs, so more than 1 in 3. That equates to about 6,000, 7,000 claims a year for these types of injuries. Around $20,000 is the current figure for the average cost of these claims. So it's a really significant problem, and you can see a staggering amount of money when you look at that cumulatively. $455 million being the spend on these claims, and that's direct costs. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the other costs that you might find with this. And I think the point to pause on there is, as big as the dollar factor is, that's absolutely always dwarfed by the human cost of these injuries. So we need to put the people at the front of this. The dollars are big, yes, but the impact on people is always going to be greater. Now, I think we need to put that front and center. We can see every industry here is represented when it comes to these claims. So healthcare and social assistance industry tends to lead the way in terms of prevalence, but no industry is immune to this. And when we look at the mechanism of these injuries, so what's causing them, what type of movements or actions are leading to these, you can see there 36% are from lifting or carrying objects. And I think that's historically what we would equate with body stressing injuries. I lifted something heavy or I had to carry a heavy load. But the bit I'll draw your attention to are the bottom two numbers on the right. So 21% for repetitive tasks and 15% no object being handled at all. So when you add those together, what we see is the same amount of claims for musculoskeletal injuries are coming from tasks where actually no forceful action was being done, or it was something that was more repetitive in nature. And I draw your attention to that because as we talk through today, you'll see that we need to start thinking beyond how heavy was the box or how heavy was that load and start to analyze that more deeply to find the real sources of risk. You can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alex. We now have a clear understanding how these injuries occur. Aaron, what is the driver of these injuries from the work health and safety perspective lens, and what are the expectations from a regulatory perspective in managing these risks?
Thanks, Olga, and thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's always quite alarming seeing those number of injuries, but the key in there is these types of injuries are often doesn't come just from a single instance, as you were alluding in there. So it's often those physical demanding tasks and work after day after day. That's what leads to those injuries. So sitting here in the SafeWork SA from a regulation perspective, if you look at the WHS regulation, these are often referred to as hazardous manual tasks or injuries that are associated with these hazardous manual tasks. So the definition you see in front of you is coming straight from the code of practice. So these are tasks that involves lifting, lowering, pushing, pulling, carrying, or otherwise moving or restraining anything, and involves one or more of the key risk factors. When we see to that definitions, it's already involving basically any activities in the workplace. But not all manual tasks as hazardous. So it defines that any hazardous manual tasks includes some sort of repetitive or sustained force, high or sudden force, awkward or sustained posture, and repetitive movement or vibrations. So you can already start thinking about some of the examples on your own workplaces. So these are the type of demands that leads to this type of injuries. Thanks, Olga. So when we break this a little bit further and we look at the regulation plus what causes these injuries, as we have seen earlier that Alex explained that causation model and what leads to those injuries is often not only one factor, is the interaction of many factors. And that's what's as well specified in the code of practice, in the hazards manual task code of practice or in the regulation itself. So if you want to manage these tasks, you must give consideration to all these risk factors, postures, movement forces, the duration and frequency of the tasks, but also looking beyond that into how the nature and weight of size of things being handled, the work area design and layout, how work is organized, and the work environment itself. So usually is the combination of these different factors that results or leads to injuries. If we go to the next slide, Olga. Thanks, Olga. So from WHS as well, regulation, there is regulation 60 that very clearly specifies on how businesses must approach or manage these types of risk on MSD risks. So it sets a clear, it calls for part 3.1 of the WHS legislation, which requires a business to use a risk management approach, basically, starting from hazard identification and then looking into eliminating or minimizing risks using the hierarchy of control, and then maintaining or reviewing those controls. And most importantly, that all these steps are included or involves workers' consultation throughout this process. So in summary, to summarize it here, so any businesses, or I'm thinking as well from service provider, if you are providing services to a business or a business that wants to manage these types of risk, these are the expectation or this risk management process that you need to go through. So it's to systematically identify hazards at first place, and then controlling them effectively, and then working through workers throughout this process. Thanks, Olga. So what we going down when we started putting together this presentation early on, we started thinking about our involvement in here from SafeWork SA perspective in compliance and enforcement work, or from Return to Work SA perspective when they engage for the business. We found that there are some of the common practices what we are seeing in the field. So either from a business or from a service provider. So we usually see some of the documentation, some of the practices in businesses, and we have seen or found some opportunities that we can share with you today, where we are seeing some of the gaps and how can we improve those, or some opportunities for improvement. Before I go further, though, it's important to acknowledge that there are a wide range of businesses, and we interact with a lot of businesses, from small operations to a large organization across different industries. So the insight that we will be sharing today might not apply to every workplace. And we also acknowledge that there are some businesses out there that are doing really well in this space and have some strong systems in place. And the attendees in here some businesses in here relate to that. But what we are sharing is what we constantly see as a common gaps and some opportunities that we'll be focusing today, and this will hopefully help you in managing better these types of risks. Thanks, Olga. So the first key part in here, as I mentioned earlier on, as a part of the WHS regulation, the first step is to conduct hazard identification, is to identify those tasks that are hazards. When we often go to workplaces and we ask businesses, how do you identify these types of risks? The typical response that we often use is our workers can report hazards. We have a reporting systems. We use these QR codes that are in here. We have a really good reporting culture in here, and workers raising issues in here. While these are really positive initiatives, what we are seeing this coming back is what we often don't see businesses actively doing is looking for that information to identify any trends and risks. So these systems that we see tend to be more reactive and relying on workers actually identifying those hazards and then reporting back to the business. And what we need to see from as an opportunity in here for improvement, and that's what's said in the hazards manual task code of practice, is that systematic process and being more proactive in looking in these aspects. This includes, for example, actively consulting with workers, speaking to your workers, what causes you pain or discomfort. So these are the early signs before an injury happens. You ask workers what tasks are physically demanding, what could be done differently from there. Workers can provide you some ideas on how to control them. Businesses as well have a lot of data in terms of injury or hazard reporting, but what we don't often see is businesses are not actively looking for what are the areas or the tasks that are reported by workers and how can we change them. We also, as well, there are some aspects set in the code of practice into actually walking around and looking at workers. What are the tasks that they seem workers are embracing their body to exert a high force or adopting awkward postures, and identifying those tasks proactively. So the early identification of these aspects, or the more proactively you look, the more proactively you'll be aiming to reduce these types of injuries before they happen. If you go to the next slide, Olga. So what we have here is a part, what we call is a consultation piece. In a consultation piece or consultation example, we often use a discomfort survey. And we have this on our website. I have a code in there. This is an example that I give you in here, for example, is a worker that works in a cleaning service company. So the worker basically gets assigned jobs to clean and go to day to day to clients and then provide cleaning services. So the workers were asked, the nature of the work that you are doing, and if it is causing you pain or discomfort. We can see that the worker reported some pain and discomfort, especially in the lower back. And they reported they experiences these pains, and then they identified what are the aspects of their work that causing them pain or discomfort. So the worker in here, for example, reported vacuuming all day, scrubbing floors, and wiping surfaces. So these are the types of tasks that causing them pain or discomfort. And then as a part, what is the issue that he reported that the client's vacuum that they are using are often too short and require them to bend all day. And the last question that asks in there, it asks the worker, what can we do differently? So the worker actually proposes some controls in there. The worker proposed having a mop and a vacuum in a long adjustable handle, for example. So we can see the value from these early consulting with workers and asking workers. So workers actually report the problem and they know actually what could lead on how they can do it differently. So you already have an idea of example of controls. If we go to the next slide, Olga. So this is an example as well that we have. It is a hazard identification, how to keep records of these aspects in here. So we have the identification tool, and that's on our website. So this tool, it helps you to record the different tasks that you identified through workers' consultation or through your injury data that you identified trends. And it helps you to identify what are the characteristics of those tasks that makes them hazardous, and that's what we refer to as risk factors. For example, postures, is it forces, is it the movement, is it exposure to vibration? So this is what makes these tasks hazardous. So this is a really good way into recording those tasks. Thanks, Olga. Alex also have an example for us in here. I'll hand over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Haran. And I love with the tool that you just showed, some of those categories, and the one around worker reports, discomfort, for example, being one of those triggers to say, let's go and look at this task in more detail. So yeah, can't speak highly enough of the need for consultation. The other story I thought I'd share in this space is, I think with the businesses I've interacted with, they're typically larger businesses, and a lot of them have job dictionaries. So they've had a consultant come in and capture the key physical demands of each task that's done within the business. And as a physiotherapist, I've certainly done a number of these myself over the time. And the common finding, I think, or the opportunity here is that we can actually use the data within those to inform our safety activity. And that's a gap that we see quite commonly. So this example we put on the screen here, this was for a food production company, so growing fruit and vegetables. And you wouldn't normally equate the product that they're growing with something that is hazardous, okay? But when we go through the job dictionary, what we can find is some real clear triggers around elements to look at. So you can see it here that they're lifting a product that weighs between 3 and 7 kilograms. So you don't think that's potentially too problematic, but they're doing it 33 times a minute. And when you break that down for a 4-hour block of time, which is how long they do it for, it ends up being 40 tonne worth of product that they're lifting. And then they're wondering why there's injuries arising from tasks like this. So it's just to say that when you have something like a job dictionary, there's a really powerful use for it, which is in that hazard identification piece. And we sometimes see that it might be confused with being a risk assessment, which we'll talk to a little bit more coming up. But if you have something like a job dictionary or a task analysis or a job analysis, sit down and go through that and pull out what are the bits within that might be contributing. And you may find the answer is actually right there in front of you, and then you can move forward in the control space. So just an example we wanted to share from some of our field work. Thanks, Olga.
Excellent, Alex. That's a really good example, and we see it quite often in terms of a lot of that perception in workplaces that job dictionary is a risk assessment, and that's the confusion that we see a lot. Yeah. Another key point that we actually seen in workplaces is around that incident investigation. So as a part of my role in here, when I go to workplaces and trying to understand workplaces, I look at their incident records and I look how they investigate investigate these type of manual task-related injuries or musculoskeletal-related injuries. And what we commonly see in this is workplaces are often triggering this or putting the direct cause from these injuries is related to the incorrect lifting techniques using things like human error, and the actions that often comes from these is retraining workers. And this is very common and we see it quite a lot in workplaces. I'll walk you through the example on the right side where some of the incident investigation, for example, a worker has trained their lower back from lifting 20-kilogram bags, so they stack pallets. The immediate cause that's recorded is the worker was bending incorrectly while lifting. Contributing factors, it was recorded that the worker did not follow the correct lifting techniques. It's saved as a worker error, and the corrective actions is the worker to consult with a physio, get a refresher training, and staff to be reminded on safe lifting techniques. And as a follow-up, the physio, for example, cleared the worker, returned back to their duties, the training attendance being recorded, and the investigation is closed. And then we send him back the worker straight away to the similar physical demands of the tasks that led to an injury. In the other hand, if we go to the next slide, Olga, where we see a lot of opportunities here is instead of focusing on the worker themselves, maybe we need to switch our thinking to actually focusing on the work design and asking the question, what about the task that made that injury likely to happen? For example, was the load too heavy or awkward? Was the workspace, for example, poorly designed and required them to adopt some awkward postures? Was there a time pressure from the task? Was the equipment that they were using suitable for the task that they were doing? In most of the cases, it's not only one factor, it's a combination of different factors. But if we're looking at the design of the work and how the work is designed, we can find out a bit about these factors. So the similar example that we had, if we switch thinking from the human behavior or the worker into work design, what we can look is the immediate causes. We look at the worker was exposed actually to high force, awkward posture while stacking those pallets over an 8-hour shift. So the contributing factors was they were stacking those pallets from the floor level until above shoulder heights. The load weights varies during the day. The different bags that varies in weight from 20 to 25 kilograms. And its weights around one lift every minute and over an 8-hour shift. And that comes back to those numbers that Alex gave an example early on. When we put it all together during the whole shift, they become that huge number and how much weight that they are actually handling throughout that shift. Looking at the root causes, for example, is that high physical demands from the tasks. We're looking at the pace of work that they are doing, and we're looking at the loads that they are handling. So in a proper investigation as a corrective actions, what the business did is conducted a proper risk assessment of that task. They consulted with workers and they come up with a short-term plan, for example, to introduce pallet lifter or scissor lifter to reduce that frequent bending and stacking from ground level, and introduce some breaks and rotation throughout the day. And a longer plan, the business, for example, is to invest in actually looking at reviewing the weights of the bags. Do we need actually to have those bags at 20 to 25 kilograms? Can you reduce the weight of those bags? And looking as well into more engineered controls, for example, vacuum lifter to minimize that manual tasks. And a follow-up action, they revised the SOP, they trained workers in the new system or controls, and they checked or follow up around rotation, that rotation is occurring. So an effective investigation from this lens goes beyond that human behavior and focuses more into the design of the work itself. That's how we get the best on how to prevent this type of injuries. Thanks, Olga. And over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Haran. And yeah, love the focus on work design and job design rather than on worker behavior. I think there's some great stuff in there for all of us. And another example that we come across, and I see this one with a lot of businesses that I do work with, is the idea of using a somewhat generic risk assessment tool for manual handling tasks. So the example we've got on the screen there is something I see in many, many businesses, this 5x5 type of matrix. And in a way, it's not a problem. I think the conclusion we'll come to is that it perhaps just isn't thorough and robust enough. And we get this mix of looking at probability and then the impact or the consequence. It's a classic type of mentality for risk assessment. But to start with, there's some inherent design flaws with these types of tools, in that if you got different people doing the same risk assessment using this tool, you're likely to get different results because the terminology used in it is too broad. So what one person thinks is significant or major, someone else might think is minor or severe. And similarly with the probability aspect. So we need to be really careful that we're understanding the language used with whatever tool we're using, so that we don't miss the tasks that are hazardous, or similarly invest too much time in the ones that were never really too problematic to begin with. So just be conscious of that around how these tools are put together. But what we see is that these tools are then applied too broadly and just say something like manual handling risk. So they don't actually pick up what the sources of the risk are. They're not really picking up what the risk factors are. And because of that, we're less likely to be able to identify suitable controls. So a good risk assessment tool for a manual handling task should lead us into that thinking around what are the risk factors at play here? Where are they coming from? What are the sources of the risk? And then helping us to quantify that in a more consistent manner. So if we go to the next slide, please, Olga, I think we have an example here. Yes, we do. So this again came out of some work we were doing and some issues that we identified. And this one was an example of a task where people were stacking product on pallets, so palletizing. And we could see they were able to identify some different potential hazards, manual handling being the first one. And then they scored a certain level of risk. It's quite high, a red one always makes you worry. But the control measures identified for that were too low a level. So this reliance on technique training and PPE essentially to try and control it. And what we see is the residual risk rating. So what's the risk after we put the control measures in? Still really high. So it's to show that we need to be thinking about using a tool where it is leading us to find what are the risk factors and what are the sources of the risk, because otherwise we go through the process, we take the time to do it, but it's not helping us get to the right conclusion, and too high a level of risk still remains. And if we go to the next slide, Olga, the opportunity part. So the picture there, and there's a QR code for this on the SafeWork SA website, a risk assessment tool that actually is capturing those sources of risk and the risk factors. So it really is a two-step process that we like to see used here. So what are the risk factors? So is it postures, forces? Is it vibration? Is it the interaction of all of these things? And the answer is yes, it is. But then where are those factors coming from? And which we spoke about at the start today. So is it the design of the work area that's leading to those risk factors being present? Is it the nature or the characteristics of the product or the object that might be being handled? Is it the environment, or is it the system of work being used? So where are these factors coming from? And by thinking through it in that manner, what you find is that you get a lot more clarity on the bit about the task that you want to change, and you know where to go to do that. So these tools should really be helping you to get to that conclusion. And if you're finding that you're doing it and there's still problems remaining, it might be that we need to use a slightly different tool to help us. And there are many tools out there as well. And this one's a really good one, but there are other tools we can utilize as well. Thanks, Olga.
Thanks, Alex. These are really good points and examples. And just to add to that point as well, as Alex mentioned, there are more sophisticated risk assessment tools in there. And we expect, for example, from our perspective, we expect if you are engaged in a service provider or a consultant, these are the degree or the type of risk assessments that we want to see. Or as a business, if you are engaged in someone, these are the type of things that you expect them to look at. There are plenty of examples of risk assessment in there. If you look into something to quantify those risks, for example, Snook tables or Liberty Mutuals or NIOSH lifting equation, for example, that quantify the risk of MSTs, or if you want the system level, for example, the Affirm toolkit, if you want to address those both physical and psychosocial demands. So these are the type of level of details that we expect businesses to have, and we expect as well service providers to, when providing their services, to consider these types of assessments. Another point that we often as well see in businesses is that commonly relying on administrative control is when we ask the question, what controls do you have in place to manage these manual tasks? We often see something like a training. We see businesses seeing these manual tasks as part of the job, and they can't see them done differently. So they introduce training, they introduce some rotation to an extent, but that's often the approach that we see. While these might be beneficial to an extent, is we rarely see business actually considering higher order controls. And if you go to the next slide, Olga. So what businesses should be looking at when looking at hazardous manual tasks is actually asking that question, can we eliminate this task in first place? Can we redesign it? Can we change into those physical and psychological demands from that tasks to reduce the risk? Can we introduce any engineering controls or lifting aids to minimize that manual tasks? So these are the things that businesses should look at. So we see often that businesses as well invest, for example, or put an investment into actually getting someone external to provide training, and that training, for example, focuses on body movement and all how to lift and stuff. But the idea in here, could a business switch that investment, for example, and thinking more into actually what can we implement in the workplace as a higher order control? Can we engineer that task? Can we purchase any equipments or lifting aids that could help with that? So the idea in here is the thinking about where to invest when you are implementing these higher order controls, and ideally is to invest in something higher level controls to actually address the sources of those risks. Thanks, Olga. So these are some common examples, and some of the key things in here. There are some of the key tasks that are common across different industries or different workplaces. And looking at industry practices and looking what's common in there, it helps you to identify those controls. There are plenty of controls out there. Speaking, for example, we spoke a lot about pallet stacking or palletizing. There are adjustable scissor lifters or height adjustable lifters that people use. And this reduces that bending, for example, and allows for workers to stack those pallets at a waist level. These are common controls in workplaces. We're looking at, for example, when you are lifting things into a ute or into a truck, that are the David arm or tailgate lifter. These are commonly used in businesses, and they are not really expensive, and you can implement crane as well. There are as well purpose-built engineered controls, for example, this racking system for tires in tire places. When we're thinking as well about that element of postures as well, is a lot to do around adjustability. For example, if we see in the example, the first example around vacuum lifter and adjustable wand or handles in there, that fits for most of individuals. If you have a short worker, if you have a tall worker, you can adjust it. Similarly as well for benches or tables or desks, if that adjustability elements helps into preventing those awkward postures. And we've seen as well a lot of advancement in healthcare, for example, for tools, lifters, or slide sheets or slings into workplaces, different elements that happening and going away from that manually helping patients into actually using some different controls. Thanks, Olga. again, it's just a sum of example we usually see in businesses. The main thing that when we ask businesses about different controls, the cost comes as a barrier into when considering those higher level of controls. But when we think about the adverse outcome when an injury happens, we often see, for example, just the tip on what's above the water. We see compensation premiums, we see medical expenses, rehab costs, and lost time. But there are, in reality, a lot of things that the business must has to absorb when facing these types of injuries. We are talking about delays in production. We are talking about overtime or replacement of that labor or worker. We are still talking about sick pay, loss of skill and experience from those workers that gets injured and leaves the business, for example, damages to tools and equipments from incidents. There is supervisory time or time spent in investigation, for example, and there might be as well the reputational damage and clients impact. So the message here is, rather than seeing these higher order controls as an upfront expense, they should be seen as a strategic investment for the business, one that prevent those injuries and help actually reduce the total cost of the business that we see here from injury. Thanks, Olga. And that's from a WHS perspective. In the WHS Act, we use the term reasonably practicable. And that sets it clear for a business. So business or a PCBU is responsible to ensure that we have done basically everything that is reasonably practicable to ensure the health and safety of your workers, and weighing up all these different elements, the likelihood of the hazards, the degree of harm that can cause to workers, and what the person concerned is known. So what do we know from that, the hazard itself, and what are the ways into eliminating or minimizing this risk? And that's what I mentioned in those examples early on. For example, there are some common controls in workplaces. Are those reasonably practicable if we are across them? The question everyone in the business should ask these questions. There are a lot of plenty controls out there for different tasks. And then consider the availability and suitability of ways to reduce or minimize exposure to those risks. And then the cost element as well. If we go to the next slide, Olga. And here is a one that Alex liked it a lot in terms of where we see a lot in businesses in this aspect as well. So we go out in business, we ask a question how they are managing hazardous manual tasks. Maybe a lot of people will relate to that. So every response often we get is the first response is we provide a manual handling training, and we hear things like all our workers are trained. We have an external person that comes along and teach workers the correct lifting techniques. We even have a physio on site showing them the proper lifting technique. And I'm sure many of you here will relate to this approach. The key message in here when I'm talking about this lifting technique training is often things that they are focused on the body of the worker. For example, bend your knees, keep your back straight, these types of exercise and warm-up stretch that goes through these general principles of the correct lifting technique. And we have seen a lot of these stickers, for example, or flyers in businesses. If we go to the next slides, Olga. So from a research perspective, coming from a research perspective for myself, I always try to back up everything with evidence. Is there any evidence there? Looking at the research evidence, there are really high quality research evidence out there, including systematic reviews across different industries globally that shows that this type of training does not reduce the risk of MSTs. So while training might improve some awareness or give workers awareness, it does not actually control the risk, as we mentioned early on from the source. It does not change that physical and psychological demands of those tasks. On the right hand, what we can see in there, so the heads of workplace health and safety authorities is called HAWSA, which involves all regulators across Australia. In 2022, they have this position paper around how to lift training. And the paper outlines clearly what is the expectation from regulator. clearly says, based on this research, that this type of training is not effective, and it does not meet the criteria what is suitable and adequate training when it comes to hazardous manual tasks. And we will get to that shortly. Thanks, Olga. Alex, over to you.
No, just great points, and it's something I've been, I guess, fortunate enough to see from a lot of different perspectives, and even for myself personally in my own practice, and having done this for probably longer than I care to think now, in a way, that I can relate to this. And I know for myself earlier on in my career, I'd be engaged by a business to go and provide their staff manual handling training, and it really was, in hindsight, that how to lift type training. And we would often use a PowerPoint type presentation and show the correct sort of body mechanics in a classroom type setting. And at the time, that seemed great. People, were okay with it. But you realize it actually was doing nothing to address the characteristics of the tasks that were being performed. Conversely, a bit later in my career, I was able to work with a wonderful team in the healthcare setting, had a really robust training program. And I think the middle dot point on your screen there sums it up really nicely, that training shouldn't really be the control by itself. It should be there to support higher level control measures. So the really thorough example I mentioned in the healthcare setting, the bulk of the training was around how do you actually use an engineering control? So, and how do you use that correctly? So that's the bit that you're training workers on, rather than relying on their own behavior and a reliance on people to conform to this one set of postures, which for some people actually isn't really the best way for them to move. So how do we actually change the work rather than relying on trying to change the workers? If anyone wants to Google Procrustes after this one day, feel free to do that. That might open your eyes. It's safe to do on your work computer, but it's a little bit gory. So I'll just drop that one in there too. But yeah, this focus on let's try and change the work rather than the workers, I think is a really nice message for us. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Haran.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that's a really good example that we commonly see in workplaces, and where opportunities actually for a risk assessment. And that's what leads me straight into, from a compliance perspective, sitting here in SafeWork SA. So we have in the code of practice, it sets clearly what should be included in that risk, in the into a training for manual tasks to be suitable and adequate. So the task basically, or any training, should address, clearly provide to workers how risk is managed around hazardous manual tasks, what are the elements in their tasks that are hazardous, and then it should be specific to the task performed by the workers, and clearly specify what are the controls in place and how workers use those controls. And these are the key elements in there. And also how to perform that task using any controls in place, including any mechanical aids, tools, equipments, or your SOPs in place. And a key element as well is to inform workers, if they are using these type of controls in place, how to report any problem or maintenance issue that raises from those controls in place. On the right-hand side, we have the checklist that we developed clearly for businesses to help you look at your training programs. Does it actually addresses what is required or not? And does it look at these elements that we clarified now? Does it look at your controls in place and training your workers and the tasks that they are performing and the control in place? So it's freely downloaded from our website. Thanks, Olga. All right, so that's bring us to the end, and I think the messages that we get across in here are consistent from Alex's view as well. So either you are an employer or engage in a service provider or a consultant into looking. So the expectation to addressing these hazards, and the most effective way is to use that proactive risk management approach, looking through hazard identification, risk assessment, and then implementing control measures using the information that you already have in place, consulting with your workers, and that gives you really understanding of those demands of the tasks that they are in place or that the workers conducting. On a similar note as well, so we look at those incident investigation, and we're looking at, instead of actually focusing on the worker, let's shift the focus onto the work itself. It also means me moving beyond that explanation of human error and actually focusing on how work is designed and controlled. So these elements, what we see a lot of benefits in there, and looking at those physical and psychological demands of those tasks. And ultimately as well, choose wisely where to invest your controls. So apply the higher order control and invest where it will give you the greatest impact in reducing these types of risk. We are talking here about some engineered controls, system design. We're looking at tools, lifting equipments, or any engineered solutions that reduce those exposure to the hazard in that task. And lastly as well, so similarly as well as if you are an employer or if you are a consultant or service provider, make sure that any training that you provide to your workplace is suitable and adequate. So the general principle to use here is a training. Training is not a control. Training should be support the control that you have in place. And that's the thinking that we try to businesses, either you are a business or you are a service provider, make sure that you train workers in the actual controls that you have in place to support the use of those controls. Thanks, Olga. And this is broadly some of the elements. So keep an eye on our website. So we're keeping the hazards manual task web page. So we have over the last year or so, we included a lot of new content on there, new guidance materials, plenty of resources. And we're working as well to develop some resources industry specific. We started the construction. This is only launched the last month and hazards manual task in construction. So it has a lot of guidance in there, examples of risk assessment and examples of controls. Thanks, Olga. We also have this series of tools that you can use that we went through during this session. An example or I want to highlight in here, that last tool, the system self-assessment tool. If you want to start today and you look at your business, how you are performing in managing these tasks, this is a really good tool to get you started. It will help you to align what's your current practice and when you can make some improvement. Thanks, Olga. And we also have developed recently some series of flyers and brochures that helps you actually summarize what we talked about today and gives you a summary of these tools that you can use. And thanks, Olga.
Thank you, Haran and Alex, for a wonderful presentation and insights on managing MSD risks in the workplace and the range of resources that would help our businesses through this process. We have a few minutes to address any questions raised.
Okay. I think there's one here from Andrew,
Andrew, yep,
around the mechanism of injury. I believe it is the 36% of MSD injuries coming from repetitive tasks or tasks where there was no object being handled. And it sounds like, Andrew, you're asking, is there data to verify whether this relates to an aging workforce that might be predisposed to injuries? Wonderful question. Yes, there is. And the answer is we're not sure. So when we look at age profile for claimants across South Australia for MSDs, which I look at quite frequently, there's actually very little variation in the prevalence of these claims at different age brackets. So we look at it over a 10-year block, so 20 to 30-year-olds, 30 to 40-year-olds, and so on. And we see it's about 22, 23% for each age bracket. The challenge with interpreting that is, while the rates look even across the age brackets, we don't know what the head count is of the workforce in those age brackets. So it may be that people in the older age brackets are overrepresented, and that can be for a magnitude of reasons, but without that headcount data, we can't conclusively come to that conclusion. But talking to businesses that I work with, this concept of an aging workforce does seem to be quite prevalent, and I think it aligns with quite low unemployment levels, where people, when you have a lot of people out there working, businesses have less people to select from to do certain tasks. So there can be this risk that creeps in at a society level, that people end up being matched to tasks that perhaps they didn't have the capacity to do, which speaks to the need to understand this topic, I think. So yeah, great question. I think there is an alignment there, but we don't have the data to conclusively say so. I hope that answers your question, Andrew.
Thanks,
Okay.
Alex. Yeah, I've seen a presentation or a request in terms of the PDF presentation. Unfortunately, not at this stage to be shared. We are recording this, and there might be a recording posted because we have a repeat session in a few weeks' time. And we will assess it from there. But there may be a recording posted on our YouTube channel, so keep an eye on that. And I also see a lot of contents in terms of acknowledging some of the aspects around training, and it does not address the actual processes in workplace or the job demands, which is a really good point. That last question probably for you, Alex. Does the data combine both physical and psychosocial elements of the MSDs as an injury?
Oh, another great question. No, it doesn't. So the data will be based on the diagnosis. So for an MSD, it might be something like a lumbar strain, rotator cuff tear, ankle sprain, tennis elbow, whatever the injury might be. Where the psychosocial elements come in is they predispose people to having the injury because that's part of the characteristic of it. So for some injury types, there's some evidence out there now that the psychosocial factors are actually the primary contributing factor rather than the physical elements. So things like neck pain, some research that actually the psychosocial factors may be the lead in those things, whereas other injuries like upper limb injuries, you see the physical hazards being more the primary contributing factor to that. But where we see these elements play out, so while it's just the injuries that are captured, where we see these play out particularly is in recovery. So we know that people with higher levels of psychosocial distress tend to recover slower. And there's a lot of tools in that injury management space, things like the Arebro questionnaire, you could look up the short form of that, that try and pull those factors out to aid in recovery and return to work. So yeah, again, hope that answers your question. Happy to chat on that topic anytime needed.
So move on to the next.
Regarding MSDs, we are getting diagnosis and treatment quickly enough. Assessment and treatments, where some people are not getting such as more as a comment rather than question.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew,
yeah, but
I
really
think...
good. Yep,
yes. I feel tempted to take a swing at this, being a physio myself. I think it's a team approach, and there are situations where it may be another provider that needs to take the lead for a certain case. So it's about, I think in that regard, it's about how do we work together. And when we see recovery not following the normal pattern or picture that we would anticipate, that should be a really clear flag for everybody that we need to start thinking more broadly than we perhaps initially did. And that's often where those psychosocial factors will be uncovered. But the quicker we can do that, the earlier in the piece we can do that, the better we will be. And then even moving upstream of the injury, and really what we've talked to today, how do we try and prevent these injuries in the first place? So then we lower the volume of people with an injury so we can give more support to the people that actually really need it.
Good point. Yeah, seeing the flavor inherent to that physical and psychosocial space in there. Yeah, there is a growing evidence that there is a relationship or an association between the two that leads to MSDs. And that's a part I'm thinking from a prevention perspective. And when we're talking about risk assessment in there, that's the part or what we call system of work or work organization, or how work is organized in the workplace. There what you will start identifying some of the elements like the pace of work or the workloads or the physical demands or the time pressure. So these are all the elements that you can identify earlier on in your risk assessment and you address them. Yeah. All right, that's about time.
Okay, Ninan Marie, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. We appreciate your time and participation. There is a QR code provided on the screen if you want to book any complimentary work health and safety advisory services via our SafeWork website. Our advisors are there to provide the complimentary free information and guidance to support workplaces in understanding the work health and safety responsibilities. So do please take the opportunity to actually book us through the online, which is the request for service advisor form, or give us a call on 1300 365 255 for any further information. We also want you to look out for our safety campaign. Stanley, you can see on the right there, is an animated traffic cone who represents a safety reminder at workplaces. And the key messages are, you know, make sure you check before you climb, engage the brake to clean up the spill. So have a fabulous day and please keep safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. Thanks, everyone.
All the best.